Today's topic is users and groups. I initially thought, well, this will be an easy one. This will be a leisurely afternoon. But the more I thought about users and groups, it really can get quite involved. So I've tried to keep it as concise as I can and try and avoid going too deep into the subject. Now, there are videos on all of these topics available, and clearly we can take questions at the end. Before getting into the topics, what I would say is many customers have installed DDM at different times, and what we deliver as the out-of-the-box has changed over the years. Our understanding of the requirements, or what we would consider the basic requirements, is also evolving all of the time. So basically, you might all have slightly different configurations within your DDM at the point of install. If you combine that with the fact that you've probably had multiple administrators since you've had or potentially had multiple administrators since you've had DDM. You know, I work with customers all of the time, and when we go into their admin tool, there's often a lot of things in there that are configured in a way were correct at the time, but can be done better today. So, you know, it's a constantly moving thing. So what I wanted to try and do today was really top tips and tricks and what I would consider to be a good way of having it organized. The challenge for most people when they go into the admin tool is understanding what is default out of the box or what might have been added by a previous administrator, because most people are a bit nervous about changing things, not understanding the implications of what they're changing and the effect it might have on something else. So I just wanted to sort of preamble that a little bit, because there's no real right or wrong to this. It's constantly evolving based on our understanding and the requirements of the customers and however you've configured DDM for your own particular use as a company. So I'm going to start by discussing user ID, name and domain. I'm going to go into the DDM administration tool. Okay, so these are all the users I've got in my system, and they're just people I've worked with previously or names that I've made up. Okay, if you didn't know, you can switch on and off disabled users. So if somebody leaves your company, it's as well to disable their account. There's an option here, disable account. Okay, because that will also block any passwords, so they wouldn't be able to access, especially if you'd made it available through the web. Okay. The other thing you can do here, and it's not turned on by default, is that there is a show search panel here. It's a right click on the header row, show search panel. And this is useful because, as I've just done, you can start to filter down STU because I'm looking for this particular user. So if you have a large number of users in a lot of the admin area in this tool, you can switch this search panel on. Okay, well, I'm going to open this particular user. This is who I'm logged in as, and I've seen a lot of customers where the user ID has been set up as a number or like SMAC or Joe, or very simple short names. And of course, as the system evolves, that starts to become a bit tricky, and especially if you've got new people starting with the business or unfamiliar with who everybody is. My recommendation, and I can only call it that because it's not right or wrong, is first name and family name. It's very easy to understand who you're dealing with at that point. Okay, now, in addition to that, some companies have domain authentication, and that's the reason why a lot of the user IDs have been set up as the domain name. We have an attribute in here that can be used for that domain name. So if you, in the admin tool, there is the option in here under security. Sorry, I need to close the other window first. Let me just confirm that. So if, for example, you're using domain authentication in here, which I'm not, okay, I don't have a domain configured, but that means against the user account, you can still have an understandable user ID and your internal domain ID as well in conjunction with that. Okay, so looking back at my topics, the user ID, the name and the domain ID, I think it's pretty important to set off on the right foot if you're going to have DDM with lots of users over time. Okay, now the next one is users default business unit. We do have customers that use business units, and a business unit is a higher level access control. So you have your normal access controls, but what you could do is you might say, well, we need a business unit for MOD or DOD work. You know, we might have our standard commercial business, but we have a different set of data that we don't want made visible to everybody else. You could also use business units for departmental segregation of the data as well. So there's lots of different reasons why you might want business units. Now, the reason for having a default business unit, okay, and in my case, my default business unit is I'm a member of engineering. Okay. Now, it might be you might want to choose whichever particular business unit that is. So what it means is if I'm inside DDM and I, for example, go in and create a new item, the default business unit that it's applied to that item is based on the user's default. Okay. If I wanted to put this into a different business unit, I can only put things into a business unit that I am a member of. Clearly that makes sense because I shouldn't see any of the others. Okay, so against the user account, you can have a default business unit. If you're not using anything other than the default, there's no need to worry about anything along those lines. So, let me go back to my workshop topics. So domain name and user ID, just a recommendation to give good names. Let me say we've talked about that, although I'm going to make another comment now. And default business unit. Okay. Just on the domain name and ID, we do now have the ability to rename a user. So if you decide you do want to tidy this up and put them in a more consistent syntax, you can start to rename users. When you go into this panel, you need to read all of the necessary warnings or the cautionary notes. So as you go through making your decisions, it's well worth reading all of this, because if you have things that are assigned to that particular user, it all has to be moved across, etc. So it will walk you through in this wizard if you want to start renaming users. The next topic is the user's default profile. Now, DDM out of the box, I think most people just use literally the default profile. If I edit this profile, so in the admin tool under system access profiles, and what this is, okay, is you have a name of the profile. You now have the ability to set the default web UI settings that we'll talk about in a minute, what dashboards are available to that profile, which again we'll talk about in a minute, and what is the default dashboard. The basics are, when you create a new drawing, document or part, well, are these object types visible? Okay, yes or no. If you turn these off, when you log into DDM, you won't, if I turn documents off, and this is my profile, I won't see any documents. So again, it's another kind of access control. Well, if I create a new item, whether it be a drawing, document, part or assembly, mine are going to begin at issue 1. Okay, if you have for whatever reason, different people in the business, some might create ABC, some might use numeric, etc. When we create a new item, we can say what the status is going to be. If we issue a new item, what the status will be, or if we upload something through the web. So this is what we call profiles. Now, I've added additional profiles, and there's a reason for that, and we'll come to it, because different departments might have different settings. Typically, the different settings are beyond what we see in the bottom table here. It's more to do with your default UI settings in the web environment. Okay, because we've started to extend this in the latest version. Right. Default profiles. Because every user has a default profile. What is your default profile? My default here is literally default profile. Okay, if I change it, I could say, well, I'm a member of engineering. That's now my default profile. So when I log into the web, I will get the setup that has been applied to that default profile. Let's go back. Okay, something that we included, I think, in the 2023.03 version of DDM is users, job title, company. I've written that twice, apology, department, etc. Now, if we go back to the user, these are attributes that don't affect anything else. It's literally just somewhere where you can say, what's that person's job title, what company, what department, and a contact number. For big organizations, not everybody knows everybody, so it's quite useful to be able to see this information. Now, it does appear in a couple of areas in the DDM Office client. So I'm going to go into the DDM Office environment, and if, for example, I go and find a change order, if I was going to assign that change order to somebody else, I get my assign to dialog. Sorry, I've got some magic stuff happening with my Windows here. Apologies. Let me just do this. There's a new feature in Windows to be able to do that. Right. So when I choose a particular department and I see the user, as you can see on my system, the user ID is your first name and your family name. You get that alongside it anyway. You get the email address, and now you get job title, company, and department. So it's quite useful to be able to see, because you might not know what people do within an organization. So I think that's particularly useful. So if you're assigning a folder to somebody, that's where you start to see it. Or, okay, I don't own it, so I'm going to pick on this one and say, let's move this back. When I'm moving it back, again, when you choose a department, so let's say department, in fact, I'm going to pick managers. Okay, and in here we can see what their job title, etc. is. In fact, if I was to pick management team, have I given people proper, technical director, quality manager, mechanical engineer, etc. This is where it's useful, where you have a common group, but there are different people who have different job titles. Okay, so I think useful and definitely worth putting a bit of time into the admin tool, because that information helps all users. Right, let's go back to my topics. It's not what I want. Go to here. So those basic attributes. Complete. Right, the next one is Users Office UI settings. This is a new thing in the latest release. And what it means is, if I, for example, go to my recent items, now I'm logged in as Stuart McBurney here. If you want to start setting defaults up, I would probably create a new user, and I would create a user, maybe sample.default profile or something. So you have the ability that if you change the layout of your screens, let's say I want to include created on as one of my default attributes in the display. So let me put that before category. So I've changed my screen layout to include created on. If you change some of your options in Tools Options, again, you can change all of your settings and options in here. When you exit DDM and do a file exit, those settings are saved to that user's account. Within here now, we can copy an Office UI profile. So we can copy those settings and apply them to other users. There's a really good example of this actually. If I go back in to DDM Office, against my change orders, so if I go to change orders and I'm looking at the content of a change order, there are attributes that I want to have switched on by default. Now, whether it's in this window or whether it's in the actual change order window itself, you see here I've got stock quantity, stock action, order quantity, order action. So these are my sort of impact assessment fields. Okay, well, let me see, we've got description, and let's just turn something else on, for example, mass. Okay, now, when I exit here and I close out, if I copy my UI settings and, for example, I apply them to, let's go John Herstick, paste UI profile settings. You need to make sure the user is not logged in at the time. Okay. You can also, by the way, copy those settings on an entire group, which is a lot quicker to do. And you can also select multiple groups to apply settings. So if you're creating custom attributes and you want everybody to see the same screens in the same way so it doesn't get missed, this is how you would do that. I'm going to log in as John.Herstick. So if I log in as John Herstick, I'm going to go to, well, I've got it on here, open change orders. If I open a change order, you can see in here I've got the mass attribute in the same place because I've copied and pasted the user interface profiles settings. Okay, I need to remember to go back in as myself now. Let's go back in as and I have got a password on this account. Okay. So, go back to workshop. Go back to today's topic. So, users' Office user interface settings, the ability to set them as a user and apply them to other users. And again, my recommendation would be to create a dummy user as a default, log in as that user, set everything up so that when you then apply it to somebody else, nobody is going to change that user because they're not actually using it. It's a good way to keep a copy of a default. Right, complete. Users web UI settings. Okay, well, against a user account, and let me go back to users. I'm a member of a default profile engineering. That default profile for engineering, the default web UI settings has been set as engineering department. So if I log into the web, that's not what we want. What we want is to go to here, tools, log into the web client. If I log in as myself, for example, if I just search on parts, if I show the columns in here, these are the columns that I've got configured for this environment. Well, as an individual user, I can change the layout. I can go into the column chooser and decide how I want the screens laying out. Or what I could do is if I log in as an administrator, okay, I can say, right, I want to go in and I want to load the UI settings for the engineering profile. Okay. If I go into parts, for example, because your screen layout is different for all the different areas of the product. So in this case, okay, let me just do this. I've got description, state, item number, etc. Well, I'm going to go to my column chooser because what I actually want to do is the number I want to be in the first column. I want the issue in the second column, then the description, then the state. Okay, I also want to add, let's say, business unit. I want to add category. Let's say, and let's say the recommended attribute, add. So down here, I've added business unit, category, and recommended. Well, I typically put category before state, and recommended I put between state and category. So I'm going to save those settings. Okay. So now what we can see is item number, issue, description, category, recommended, state, and business unit. So I've changed the UI settings. I now want to save these, and remembering I'm logged in as an administrator, so I can now apply these to the engineering profile. And I want to force this update so that the next time anybody in that user profile logs into the web, it will change their settings to what I've just set. Am I sure? Yes, I am. If I log out from here and I log back in as myself, if I now go to parts, for example, then the fields that I've got switched on are exactly as I set as the administrator. And this can be for all areas of the product, whether you're looking at parts assemblies, drawings, documents, different folder types, action types. Each different area has its own columns and layout. And it's the ability to set those as an administrator and save them and apply them to a particular profile that is used by a user as a default. Okay, so back to here. User web UI settings. Let's set that as complete. The next one is users web dashboard settings. So let's go back to the admin tool. Okay, now this particular user, or this profile should I say, has what dashboards are available to this user. Only the default user's dashboard is available to this engineering profile. Okay, well, if I cancel that, if I go to the profile for quality assurance, and this is a good reason for having profiles, if I edit this profile, I've created a default dashboard called quality assurance. This user has actually got access to the default and the quality assurance dashboard. Okay, so let me cancel that. If, for example, I log out as that user and I'm going to go back in as the administrator. Okay, now this is the default dashboard, and I've been creating some additional dashboards, and we can see in here we've got a quality assurance dashboard. So I've edited the dashboard, okay, and as you can see here, I've added some widgets on the bottom of the screen, so I can clearly see here we've got 2 open non-conformances, 4 open change orders, 5 corrective actions, 6 audits, and 3 periodic reviews. What I've added underneath is the ability to say create new NCR. So if I click on this, I can go straight in and create a new change order, rather than saying create new folder and what type of folder I want to create. If you want to make it much more visible and easy for users, you can do this. We can edit this dashboard because it might be that I want to move this particular group of widgets to the top row. Move those up and move these underneath them. Okay. I'm going to make one final change. Let's say new periodic review. I want to edit this widget and I want to change the icon that I'm using. So let's just say find something else. It doesn't really matter what it's just an example. Let's say this one with a plus. So I'm changing the icon that I'm using. So we say here new periodic review. I'm going to save this dashboard against the quality assurance dashboard like that. Okay, so I've done all of that work as the administrator. If I now log out and I log in as a member of the quality assurance department, Hercule Poirot, his default profile, if I go to users, Hercule Poirot, his default profile is Department Quality Assurance. If I go back into my profiles again and we go in and we edit this profile, the default dashboard is Department Quality Assurance. Okay. Confirm. When I log in, we now see we've got our updated dashboard. So effectively what we can do here, and this is combining lots of different things, the ability to customize the dashboard, customize the columns and the display of the web client that we see, and apply them to profiles, make them available. Now this particular user, I think, still has access to the default. So this is what you'll be familiar with. The one that I've created, that I've set as that person's default, is now this dashboard. Okay, this user actually has, I believe, if I say dashboard delete, because they've created their own dashboard called QA dashboard, and I want to get rid of that now because I don't need it. So you can have default dashboards, administration created default dashboards, or the users can have their own custom dashboards as well. I think it's really useful. It also means if your web client is available on a public IP address to the internet, obviously with the right security in place, then you've got access to all of this real-time information, even from a mobile or cell phone, as it gets called. Okay, so let's hop back to DDM. Users web dashboard settings, the ability to apply them against users to simplify it or make it a lot more useful to them by putting specific information on. There's a separate video on how to build your own widgets, by the way. Okay. Complete. Groups and roles. So this is typically the area that when we get involved with customers that have been a customer for any length of time, it can easily get out of control. Okay, now I'm a bit OCD. I like to have things very organized and uniform, etc. So I'm hoping my own DDM setup is going to demonstrate that. So basic users and groups. Now I often get asked the question, does this column defining a group or a role or a system group is there any logic or reason for that being there? It's a historical thing. It changes the functionality not at all. So it doesn't change anything. So I completely ignore this column. It doesn't do anything anymore. It used to, but it doesn't now. So let's just look at our groups that I've created. Now, access controls for items. Those 6 groups at the top, there's actually more than 7 because there's 2 3s there, but those groups that I've created at the top are the groups that I've created for access controls on parts, assemblies, drawings and documents, collectively called items. Okay, and you can see I've prefixed them with a number so they appear grouped together at the top of my list. So instead of having groups all over the place and trying to see the wood for the trees, when you're trying to understand something, it's nice if there's a bit of consistency. Okay, so what you can also see is I've named the group to explain what the group permissions are. So full control, all users. You know, let's say view and load, released and under review. I can see that group relative to all my business units. Okay. If I edit this group for the default business unit, I can decide who is in that group. And you see, in my case, they're all external suppliers because they're typically people who can only see released or under review. So you put your users in a group. If I go to access controls now, for items, parts, documents and drawings, you'll see here that all of these groups here are my item groups. Now, I break my own rule here. I have got some additional ones, but they're specific groups for testing that I do. Okay, so there's a reason for having those extra ones in there. But typically, for users of DDM, what controls their access to parts, assemblies, drawings and documents are these groups. Okay, much more sort of logically defined. The syntax naming means they're grouped together, and it's much easier for me to understand. If I go into load and released only, I can only see release data. My access control only allows me to load the preview of a released item. If I go to released and under review, so you can see here I've been very careful about the access controls I'm allowing based on that particular user. Okay, so my recommendation is when you're creating groups for access controls on parts, assemblies and drawings, prefix them with a name that groups them together, and in the description put what that is, because these groups are not actually seen in the user interface of DDM. You don't see them as a user. Okay, now moving on from that, these other groups, all employees all the way down to folder archive, excluding enterprise update users. Now when I'm working with folders and workflow, all of my access controls are set by department groups, and most businesses are still a collection of departments. That's how we pretty much have a business set up. So as you can see, I've prefixed every department with the word department, which of course then groups them together in the admin tool. I've given it a name and we put people in these groups. If I use the example of access controls for development projects, you can see here that I've only set access controls around all employees, folder archive and the various departments. And therefore, if I'm looking at a development project, so if I go to here and I've got a development project, if I wanted to, for example, assign this, well, okay, I've actually got this hard coded. At this step in the process, it can only go to a project management team. So I'm picking a bad example. Okay, if I walk this through the process, let's say, and I don't own it because it's owned by someone else. Okay, if I return to group and I step through, I've got a field that needs filling in, so bear with me a second. If I say I need to edit that because I haven't filled in this requirement first, we say OK, and now I can step through the workflow. I've got this hard coded to project management, so just bear with me a second. Okay. Clearly, I'm tying myself in knots here. Let me pick a different example. Change orders. This change order, if I want to assign this or send it in the workflow to another group, the groups that appear in the interface are only the groups that have access controls for that folder type. If there is nobody in a group, then the group will not appear. So you see here we've got a group finance. Okay. In the admin tool, if I say, well, actually, in that group, if I remove all users, confirm, when I then want to assign this, do I still see the finance department? No. So you don't have to delete a group out of the admin tool. If there are no users in it, it does not appear in the DDM interface, or if there's no users in it with the necessary access control. So all of these things are linked together. So don't feel like you have to delete a group to stop it appearing, because you might want to use the group in the future. You can just remove people from the group and therefore it won't appear. So let me just cancel that. Okay, so the main point is groups for item access controls and groups for working with folders and workflow. And I just find it a much easier logical way of doing it. Now, the next one, and I've only started really doing this a lot recently, and while we're here we can see we've got some power groups. These are the DDM default groups. These are hard-coded groups, and there's videos on all of these as to what they do. There's also a description here against the group to say what this group can do. Okay, I've created some additional groups for specific functional areas. Okay, these are to allow certain groups of people to use certain functionality outside of folders and workflow. The thing that I've started doing recently is creating a role, because I might be a member of the engineering department, but I might have additional privileges as the engineering manager. You know, the engineering is a department, whereas engineering manager is a role. So ignoring this second column in the admin tool that really doesn't do anything, I actually prefix the name of the group with role. Because, for example, if I'm in a workflow and I want to assign a certain task or a certain step of the workflow to a certain user, it might be, and I'm trying to think if I actually got an example of it, who to notify. No. So, but it might be that at a certain step in the process, let me go to here. Let's say when we close a change order, I might want to additionally notify a specific role, as in a specific person or group of people. So for me, role is different to department, and it's very useful when you're looking at folders, when you're looking at access controls, etc. I'm going to cancel that so I don't save that change. An example of that, or another example, let me go back to the main admin tool, is I might set access controls for a development project for departments. Now, the engineering department, you've also got engineering manager. Well, really, that should be a role now because I'm starting to use roles. But I could add an access control group here, and I want to include, for example, the engineering manager. Okay, next. Now, the permissions over and above what this person has as a member of the engineering department, I might say, well, even if they are not the owner of the folder, they can modify it when it's active or proposed. So I can apply access controls to a specific role over and above the access controls that they might have as a member of a department. So it's really just starting to logically structure the groups and the roles and the access controls within the business, but doing it by naming them in a way that we can understand what we're doing. And therefore, when you're assigning users to different groups and roles, it's much easier to do because we're using department names and titles. Okay, let's go back to our workshop. Actions, groups and roles. We've just talked about groups for item access controls, and we've also just talked about the groups for folder and workflow. So the top tip is naming convention, especially as, you know, people come and go within a business, and it makes it much easier for a new administrator to understand what's been done. Now, you can rename groups. So these engineering managers, I could say, well, actually, that's a role, and I could change the name of this group. Okay, and it's okay to do that. What you might want to check, if you've done any advanced XML business rules for your workflow and you've put in there hard-coded a particular group name, then you might need to check that to go and edit the XML. But it's only for very specific things. Typically, it's quite safe to change the name of a group to start reorganizing them to make it a lot easier for everybody.